The curlew stood silent and unseen in the long, damp grass. And he looked down on the road below him that wound its way through Bale na Bláth. And he heard the young men shouting and cursing, running backwards and forwards, dodging and weaving and ducking the bullets that rained down on them from the hillside opposite. Just as quickly as it started, the firing stopped, and a terrible silence hung over the valley. A lone figure lay on the roadside in the drizzling August rain. Dressed in green greatcoat, leggings, and brown hobnail boots that would never again set the sparks flying from the kitchen flagstones as he danced his way through a half-set. A hurried, whispered act of contrition, and the firing breaks out again. The curlew takes to flight, and as he flies out over the empty, sad fields of West Cork, with his lonesome call, he must tell the world that the big fellow has fallen and that Michael is gone.
I'll start by asking you a question. If a good friend of yours died suddenly, would you want to know what happened?
Yes.
Just keep going. So how come when Michael Collins died, and people were very suspicious at the time and demanding answers, there was no inquiry and there was no autopsy at all? None of the people at the ambush were questioned, lies were told, and there was a big major cover-up. Put simply, the ambush went like this. 25 professional soldiers travelled out as escort to the Commander-in-Chief, General Michael Collins. Following an encounter with a force of 5 men with vastly inferior arms, they brought Collins back dead. There were no other fatalities or serious injuries on either side. That's the ambush in a nutshell. Now, there's many books written about this period in Irish history. These are the ones that I've got. It's a bit of fun reading them. Some of them are rubbish, some of them are very good. The more recent ones are getting a lot better, and I think they're positioning themselves because there's such an amount of interest coming into 1916. And after 1916, you got 6 years of it to 1922, the 100 years of that as well. So there's a major 6-year period in Irish history where there'll be a lot of work done, and I think a lot of these authors are positioning for that. That's Michael Collins. Again, it's amazing how the hairstyles and the likes of that period are so similar to nowadays. I mean, we went through the 60s, 70s and 80s, but they've gone right back to the 1920s with hairstyles. John Feehan, he's well known in Cork. He founded Mercier Press in 1944 after resigning from the Irish Army. His contacts in the Army and in Cork allowed him to do invaluable research, interviewing many of those who were close to Collins and some who were actually at Bale na Bláth itself. And it really is lucky for us that he met these people before he died, before they brought a lot of information and secrets to the grave with them. But his book, Murder or Accident, Shooting of Michael Collins, that's a landmark in the Michael Collins story, and published in 1981. This one, John Toory, he's an ex-Navy American journalist, came to Ireland to write a biography of Michael Collins, and after an awful lot of research he became intrigued by Eamon de Valera and how every major decision made by de Valera was to Britain's benefit and Ireland's detriment. He then wrote the book England's Greatest Spy, Eamon de Valera. You can buy that on Amazon for Kindle for $8.34 Australian.
Good book.
Yeah.
Is it a good one?
Yeah. This one was published and released in July this year, just a month ago. And that's a new reconstruction of the ambush, what's called a cold case investigation. So it's a classic cold case. It's the first real investigation in decades, and it's certainly the most complete overview of the evidence ever published. Her experience is in security. She's an American, party politics and covert political abuses. She's not a historian. She's a lecturer in history and social anthropology, and since the 70s she's devoted ongoing in-depth research to the subject of secretive interference in lawful political activity, including politically motivated killings. So that would be Collins and lots of others too.
Could you name the
Her
book?
fascination with Collins, well, name of the book is up there.
Yeah, we'll call for this tape.
Yeah, her fascination with Michael Collins' story inspired 11 years intensive research on his work and his life and times, and leading to her relocation from America to Ireland, and first-hand acquaintance with places, people and culture that connected with Collins. Tim Pat Coogan has tweeted that her book is a valuable contribution to the literature of Michael Collins. So those 3 books, and I'll just go back to my list of books. Back in 1991, that was first published in 1981, John Feen's book, and it raised a lot of discussion in Ireland. A lot of things came out of the rooms. A lot of people objected to certain things. A lot of people came forward with new information. There were several other editions published, and the book was drastically changed. The most recent edition is in 1991, and John Feen died in that year. The second one, and on the list I gave you there, the 3 highlighted ones, is John Toory's book in 2009, and the last one, Sigerson's book, just published, as I said, in July this year. They're the 3 that I really am using for this talk.
Did you say Toory's book is available as an ebook as well?
Toory's book is available. Sorry, just get you the information. Toory's book is $8.34 on Amazon.
Yeah, no, I was looking at it, didn't drop up today. I've got Sigerson's, but
Yeah, Toory's, I had a look today, it was $8.34.
Great, thanks.
You've got to go to amazon.com.au.
Yeah.
Well, the problem is if it's not .au and you have an Australian account, you can't buy it anyway.
Yeah.
Right.
Now, if you read, look, I've been studying Collins for years, and I gave a talk back in 2002 on the 80th anniversary of his death. And all that time, I couldn't understand why Collins and his intelligence operation had broken the British hold on Ireland, and how he could then be so amateurish on this last trip, taking the convoy along dangerous back roads in County Cork, returning by the same route, ignoring warnings of an ambush, drinking in local pubs, and the ambush lasting more than 30 minutes, with only 1 casualty, himself. And we now know, of course, that was misinformation, a cover-up afterwards. So history, and we were taught rubbish history in school in Ireland. The one subject that was really, we were taught absolute rubbish. It's now being corrected with these books. We were taught De Valera's history, nothing else.
Yes.
With the 100th anniversary of the Rising just around the corner, a lot of people are actually reassessing and rewriting that history, and a lot of information has come out. We're certainly getting the truth now, and it's not De Valera's truth that we had years ago. I suppose it's the real story of Collins, Arthur Griffith, John Devoy, and others. And so to understand the assassination, we need to go back a little in time to 1916 and look at the main participants. That's the British, De Valera, and Collins himself. Start with the British. Now, the British have for centuries operated one of the greatest espionage networks in history. As far back as 1777, they spent over £200,000, which is a huge amount of money back then, in gathering intelligence and, well, international intelligence. They didn't come to rule half the world with military power alone. And their intelligence systems used bribery, intimidation, murder, transportation, just whatever was required they used. So you can imagine in Ireland the scene. And actually this scene happened, it's taken from, say, 1798. Door gets hammered down, men burst in screaming, sometimes in uniform, sometimes not. Some of the occupants are shot indiscriminately, some were beaten senseless. Just another traitor, and another blow to another insurrection, failed. And every effort to rise produced the same result, disaster. The risings in 1798, 1803, 1848 and 1867 were viciously beaten down by the British. And they knew in advance, they let it happen, and then they beat the Irish into submission. There's evidence of that. In every case they let it happen. In 1798 in particular, they brought it on deliberately. They worked it to happen. And many of the traitors have been identified, and of course they're scorned, hated, even their families today in some cases. Of course, again, many have not been identified. But the British commonly used a mole or sleeper planted for many years in rival political circles. And if you add to this a host of spies, traitors and informers. And Michael Collins, if you look at the movie and look at his life, He went after those. The intelligence gathering of the British agent was from spies and traders and informers all around Ireland. They'd set up that network. And in a way, I suppose, it's those Irish people, those traitorous Irish people, who were responsible for the suffering of countless Irish men, women and children down the years. Now, if you remember the Cairo gang, let me shoot on a little. That's the Cairo gang. They were a group of British intelligence agents who were sent to Dublin during the War of Independence to conduct intelligence operations against prominent members of the IRA and also to eliminate Michael Collins. 14 of them were promptly assassinated on the morning of the 21st of November 1920 by the IRA in a planned series of early morning strikes engineered by Collins. After this, and I suppose with the death of so many other agents, British Secret Service would certainly have relished an opportunity to kill Collins. They would have been waiting and waiting. But let's look at Michael Collins. His background, he had a happy childhood, a lot of republicanism. His father was a Republican. He was the third son and the youngest of 8 children. His father, Michael, was 60 years old when he got married. And he married Marianne O'Brien, who was only 23. She lived on the next farm. This was in 1875. Michael was only 6 when his father died. And even though he played a minor role in the Rising in 1916 in the GPO, he was making a name as a skilled organiser of considerable intelligence, highly respected in the IRB. One of the famous things he did was that when provisions came in, he took all the alcohol and poured it down the drain, saying that nobody will rise and whatever on drink in his watch. Now compare that to De Valera. De Valera had a sad upbringing, you can only call it. He was an illegitimate child born in America. People have tried to cover it up, they've tried to doctor his birth records, etc. He was discarded by his mother when she sent him back to Ireland, unloved by his grandparents, bullied in school in County Clare. 4 times he actually sought to get into the priesthood. 4 times he was turned down because he was illegitimate. He was an average student, but he worked hard and became a teacher. He was rejected for educational posts by what at the time was a bigoted Irish society. They actually thought he was Jewish with his name. He found a niche in the Gaelic League and he was one of the leaders in 1916 in the Rising. So let's look at the Rising and afterwards. As had happened previously, the British knew about the Rising in advance. They let it take place and they beat the Irish back into submission, mainly to discredit the Irish in the eyes of the Irish Americans. It was part of an effort to get the US to join the war and to get more Irishmen to enlist in the British Armed Forces for the war. They were short of 20,000 troops a month at that stage. So I suppose to understand Collins, we have to look at De Valera's actions. You've got to show that De Valera was working with the British. Right? He was the second highest ranking military officer during the Rising. He was credited wrongly with having inflicted half of all British casualties. He was made a leader because of the Irish admiration for education, but he was incompetent, neurotic. His men lacked respect for him, made fun of him behind his back. He didn't trust them. He considered them inferior, gave contradictory orders, and appeared to be on the brink of a nervous breakdown a lot of the time. When a courier arrived at one stage asking for men, food and ammunition, De Valera sent no men. He sent a fruitcake and 10 bullets. A guy called Michael Malone, he put the 10 bullets to good use, and it was Michael Malone who led the outstanding action of the Rising, inflicting more than half the casualties on the British. De Valera got the credit, but Malone got a cheap gravestone in Glasnevin. He's got one of those little 6x12 headstones in Glasnevin Cemetery. And who's ever heard of Michael Malone?
No.
But he was the top guy in 1916. It was claimed that De Valera's squad was the best trained and the best led. Actually, his men inflicted more casualties on themselves than they did on the British, even murdering one of their own men. De Valera surrendered without consulting his men. He deserted them to arrange his own surrender. This is one that's contested but fairly well proven. He didn't stand trial, he was never convicted, he was never sentenced, so he was never reprieved. At the time, there was a lot of raised eyebrows. But while he was in prison, he incited riots and general mayhem. This allayed the suspicions. His jailers publicised the trouble he was causing, raising his stature outside the prison. Minor trouble in those days normally led to solitary confinement. beatings, prisoners being manacled, sitting on their own excrement and being hosed down with cold water. Many of De Valera's comrades actually suffered those punishments, but De Valera didn't. So you've got to ask, why was he an exception? Now, let's go to Major Ivor Price. He was the British intelligence officer at Dublin Castle, reporting directly to General John Maxwell, who was leading the British and the executions and the trials. Price paraded prisoners in front of a mock firing squad, using threats and intimidation, aiming to turn as many rebels as he could. So the question is, did De Valera, or did Price make De Valera an offer he couldn't refuse, or did De Valera, who was a constant reader of Machiavelli's The Prince, make the offer? De Valera was seen many occasions carrying the Prince, the book, around with him. We know that a very strong closeness developed between the two, but neither of them obviously would write down what they talked about. Price was very skilled at manipulating weaknesses, and he was seen as a father figure who pushed the right buttons with De Valera, and it's reckoned at this stage that that's when De Valera turned and became pro-British. How do I get the next picture up? De Valera, Michael Collins. Stay there for a second. Look, the most intriguing question arising out of the 1916 rising wasn't the executions. All the documents have been released to that, but it was the failure to execute De Valera. As I said, he was never tried, never sentenced, never reprieved. The prosecutor, Lieutenant Wiley, has publicly stated that De Valera was never tried. Papers on De Valera from 1916 are still locked away in the UK, and he's the only one. All the rest have been released. We know that after 1916, every major decision made by De Valera benefited Britain to Ireland's detriment. Read Toory's book if you doubt that. It started with De Valera's comical release from Lincoln Prison to rush him to America, where in 18 months he destroyed the chances of a pro-Irish presidential candidate and split the Irish community in America in two. He collected massive amounts of money, supposedly to assist the war against the British back in Ireland. In the end, most of the money, about $3 million, which is a lot of money back then, was used to set up his own personal newspaper, the Irish Press. He was then rushed back to Europe and had secret talks with Lloyd George. We only have De Valera's account of what was discussed at those, but it's heavily rumoured that he was told in no uncertain terms that a republic was not an option, and the same with partition. The peace talks were called off at this point. On the 22nd of June 1921, the new Parliament opened in Belfast, and the peace talks were restarted almost immediately. De Valera refused to lead the delegation to London, and he forced Collins to go in his place. So when you look at the timeline, have peace talks stop. Parliament, the King goes over, opens the Parliament in the north of Ireland. That gets the 6 counties set up, Parliament-wise. And literally within 2 days, the peace negotiations are back on again. On the very day the King opened the Parliament in Belfast, the British Army raided a private residence and discovered, in quotes, and arrested De Valera. By a strange coincidence, his arrest occurred on the very day chosen by Lloyd George to initiate that new era of reconciliation. When news of De Valera's arrest was received by Dublin Castle authorities, Alfred Cope, who was the Assistant Secretary and Lloyd George's personal confidant in Ireland, he was attending a formal dinner party. He immediately deserted his guests and rushed to the jail where De Valera was being detained in the Bridewell. And rather than release De Valera immediately, Cope personally escorted him to Portobello Barracks, evicted an army officer from his quarters and gave the quarters to De Valera. De Valera was set free the following morning, without so much as a charge being pressed against him or subjected to any interrogation at all. The whole event smells as to what was negotiated on that night. After the treaty was signed, De Valera began his efforts to split the Irish, as he had done in America. He walked out of the Dáil, taking his supporters with him. When the people voted in favour of the treaty, he started the Civil War, asking his followers to wade through Irish blood. De Valera and his followers, they actually roared all over Ireland, creating havoc, ignoring the fact that it was the first time in over 700 years that Ireland had a permanent government with its own constitution and parliament. At this point, Collins was striving to have the treaty accepted in the south and to avoid a civil war, while he was supporting the IRA in the north. From the British point of view, he had to be stopped to calm the north and let Cosgrave's government, which supported being part of the Commonwealth, continue leading in the south. And that was done in steps. The British understood that with the defeat of the anti-treaty forces, by peace or otherwise, Griffith and Collins would emerge as very strong leaders. Both would insist on strict compliance with the treaty terms, especially the boundary clause, in which Fermanagh and Tyrone and the city of Derry would have been transferred to the south, making the rest of the north unpractical. Collins then would be free to turn his attention on helping the Catholics in the north. When it became obvious that Collins and Griffiths had defeated De Valera's anti-treaty forces, their deaths were a foregone conclusion. Griffith was first. In early July 1922, due to threats by De Valera's forces, Free State ministers, including Arthur Griffith, the President, took up residence in government buildings on Merrion Street in Dublin with accommodation in the adjoining College of Science, where the acquisition of arsenic, cyanide and poisons was relatively easy. And they slept in the labs, with beds and furniture from Dublin Castle. Food was delivered daily from Mill's Restaurant and the Bailey Pub. Griffith soon began showing signs of illness. His condition worsened and he was sent into hospital. He complained of headaches, sore throat, depression and sleep deprivation, all symptoms that you can attribute to arsenic or similar thing. But when you stop taking the arsenic, you recover quickly. So a little over a week after being admitted, on the 11th of August 22, a party was held marking the end of his hospitalisation. He had recovered enough to return to work the next day. On the morning of August the 12th, two female visitors, reportedly his nieces, came to visit, bearing chocolates that were allegedly laced with poison. This time, the poison was potent enough to kill him, and he dropped dead at the top of the stairs as he waved goodbye to his visitors. According to the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune, I'll read from them, reports that Arthur Griffith was poisoned circulated in Dublin at the time of his death. Inquiry among the physicians who attended the Dáil President have evoked a categorical statement that he died from natural causes, probably from heart disease. Well, the use of the word probably doesn't say they know what they're talking about. A leading physician, however, informed the correspondent that there is some talk of exhuming the body and clearing away any doubt as to his cause, holding an autopsy for the purpose of determining his death. On September the 7th, the New York Times quoted the Chicago Tribune. It was informed today by two reliable men who have just returned from Dublin that the Free State authorities have exhumed the body of Arthur Griffith and found traces of poison. A doctor and two nurses are said to have been arrested. The news was said to have been suppressed by the Dublin censors. Following day, official news reports denied that story. At the same time, it might explain why there was no inquest or inquiry into the death of Michael Collins just 10 days later. Now, two noticeable events occurred before Collins went down south on that trip. A guy called Thomas Markham, who was a confidant of Collins, he found references to a British agent codenamed Thorpe in files left behind by the British in Dublin Castle. When they left the castle, they took all the recent files with them, but they left everything that was more than, say, 20 years old, I think it was. And that's what Collins had Thorpe going through. Just shows you Collins was digging into any information he could to find out what he could. It took Markham 4 months to discover the identity of Thorpe, and early in August 22 he reported the findings to Collins. Thorpe was a British sleeper under cover for decades and allegedly a prominent Free State official whom Collins trusted and had allegedly sought advice from on numerous occasions. Collins locked the file containing all the proof in his private safe in Portobello Barracks, and he told Markham that when he returned from his inspection down south he would deal drastically with the person concerned. When Collins didn't return, Markham found the private safe had been opened and the files were missing. Somebody knew Collins wasn't coming back, and Thorpe's identity remains a mystery. The main subject is Tim Healy, who was Ireland's first Governor-General and who was involved in Charles Stewart Parnell's demise. And there was a bit of a smell around that one too. But that incident has never been satisfactorily investigated. On top of that, Collins, as chairman of the Provisional Government, equivalent to Prime Minister, he headed the cabinet and Arthur Griffith was president of the Dáil. On the 21st of July, which is 1 month before the assassination, Collins was persuaded to relinquish his position and concentrate on winning the Civil War as Commander-in-Chief of the Army. However, as John Feehan puts it, those in the cabinet who wanted to be rid of him, which he refers to as a junta, persuaded him that the great priority at the moment was to win the Civil War. He was the only one who could do it, and they should relinquish all other posts temporarily and devote himself entirely to winning the war. Cosgrave, former Minister for Local Government and until then not well known in national affairs in Ireland, became chairman of the provisional government in Collins' place. And the question is, was that neatly manoeuvred in advance so that when Collins died, Cosgrove's government, being pro-British, would just take over and continue on? There would have been a bit of mayhem if Collins had been killed while he was the Prime Minister as well. Michael Collins, Commander-in-Chief, he was under cover of a routine tour of inspection. He was travelling on a safe conduct guarantee for the purpose of peace negotiations. That is, no one was supposed to shoot at him. He was not careless of his personal safety. He was not unaware of the dangers of travelling in anti-treaty territory. He came with a well-equipped full military convoy, well capable of protecting him. Brigade officers were there to discuss peace. The soldiers were talking about peace. De Valera was discussing peace and reportedly was scheduled to meet Collins there for talks. Soldiers in the convoy believed they were escorting a peace mission. All day long and all through the journey, Michael Collins was talking about peace. Nearly everyone in the area knew that Collins was heading to Bale-na-Blaw to end the war. However, the anti-treaty officers gathered at Bale-na-Blaw didn't know because De Valera didn't tell them. That was one of the problems. For the trap to be successful, and it was a trap, in both assassinating Collins and in placing blame on the anti-treaty side, only one man could have set it up, and that was De Valera, possibly assisted by Liam Lynch. Hardly anyone else was in a position to contact all the players involved. Collins himself, possibly through Dalton, the leader of the anti-treaty side, and of course the British Secret Service. De Valera was in a position to convince Collins that he was setting up a major peace conference while keeping the anti-treaty leaders ignorant of this secret invitation to Collins and Collins' intention to make terms. De Valera was well positioned to cooperate with the British Secret Service's plans to assassinate Collins. Killing Collins ensured that the civil war continued with the anti-treaty leaders being eliminated, allowing the benign Cosgrave government to continue, the situation in the north of Ireland to settle, and De Valera, of course, to continue as their sleeper. And while De Valera didn't take part in the ambush, he lured Collins into the area. He had to be there himself or Collins would have detected a trap, and likewise the anti-treaty commanders had to be there, but they didn't know the real reason. As I mentioned earlier, just look, 25 professional soldiers travelled out as an escort to the Commander-in-Chief, Michael Collins, General Michael Collins, following an encounter with a force of 5 men and vastly inferior arms. They brought Collins back dead. There were no other fatalities or serious injuries on either side. Some of the questions. Why did Collins stop to ask directions? He knew the area well. He stopped as a signal to the anti-treaty commanders that he was in the area and he would attend a peace conference that evening. That was the signal. There's a bend in the road. Let's have a look at this. It's an extended S-bend, right? The two bends are such that people on the ground quickly lose sight of each other at a very short distance. The logic of the ambush planners was to stall the convoy in the long straight, which is along here, and that's between the two bends. Now Collins in the touring car was at the rear, which is up here. So he stopped in the lower part of the S, well before coming into the straight section. When the convoy stopped, the 4 vehicles were spread out. The motorcycle scout and lorry, which contained the soldiers, they're up at number 3. 1 is the barricade, 2 is a mine in the road, 3 is the motorcycle and the Crossley tender full of soldiers. There's about 400 metres before you get back to number 4 and number 5. Number 4 is Collins' touring car, and number 5 is the Slievenamon armoured car, Rolls-Royce armour. And they were separated, of course, from Collins by that distance and the bend in the road, so they couldn't see one another. It's been said that Collins recklessly exposed himself. Well, after the firing began, Collins got out of the touring car, which is at number 4, and moved back towards the Rolls-Royce armoured car, number 5. As the first shots were fired over 400 metres ahead, which is up here at number 2, say, there would have been little or no fire at his end of the convoy. He didn't act carelessly. He moved back from the touring car towards the armoured car. In other words, away from the firing. Then there's another intriguing question. Did the armoured car fire first? This is back at number 5. Various accounts strongly suggest that it was the armoured car's machine gun that fired the first shots and continued to fire until after Collins was dead. It was hard for the ambushers to poke their head out to see what was happening on the road with a Vickers machine gun firing continuously. The ambushers consisted of just 5 men, only 3 of whom had rifles, who by their own account, whatever firing they did was half-hearted. They had Mausers with some sort of a stock on it that fired 9mm and 7.5mm guns that were accurate to 20 metres. I mean, to actually line up and take a shot with a Mauser was just couldn't happen. The sound of continuous machine gun fire is one of the dominant impressions that is consistently corroborated by 5 ambushers and the people up front. It didn't come from the ambushers because they didn't have a machine gun. It was heard by the Crossley Tender crew up at number 3, 400 metres away, after everything was over at their end. So it wasn't the Crossley machine gun, they had one. They had a loose machine gun. It had to be the Vickers gun on the armoured car, which is number 5. It's the only one. Next question, what about the crew? The key to the assassination was isolating Collins from the rest of the party, as you can see how that happened, with the machine gun drowning any gunshots, with the soldiers well out of sight. Also, a number of the convoy personnel were reportedly either handpicked by Emmett Dalton, changed from Collins' usual crew, and or replaced in Cork. These were the only members of the convoy who could have known what happened at that end of the road, and that's who was at that end of the road, the people who were changed. That's not to say that they all knew of the plot on Collins' life, but the driver wasn't Collins' usual chauffeur, and it might be enough to select a driver who was young, inexperienced, and not known to Collins, overawed by Collins as his passenger, and of course looking to Emmett Dalton for orders, a driver who was probably easily led. The shooting from the ambushers at Collins' end of the ambush site was negligible. The sound of the Vickers machine gun created the illusion that Collins' end of the convoy was under significant continuous attack. This illusion covered the assassin's work, and when Collins was found dead, no one, of course, then asked for an explanation. So why didn't the soldiers protect him? They're up here at number 3. Over 400 metres ahead of Collins, out of sight, the soldiers in the Crossley Tender, remember they were under military discipline, they weren't in a position to make any move without the authorisation of a commander. They acted under the express orders of Commandant Sean O'Connell, and they quickly split into 2 sections, one to move the barricade, the other taking cover and firing back. They ignored Collins. So what happened at Belnablaw? When the convoy came into sight, the ambushers fired a warning shot or 2, most likely not aimed at the convoy, and didn't hit anyone. The motorcyclist Scout, when he encountered the barricade, didn't act as a scout. And you all remember the cowboy movies. When the scout found something, he shot back like a bullet to the main part, to his leaders. But they didn't do that. Instead of rushing back to inform the commanding officer in the rear, he got off his motorcycle and stood about loitering. And he played a key role because his failure to immediately alert those behind him resulted in more distance between Collins and most of the bodyguard. Now the Crossley Tender at number 3 as well, having received no information from the scout, came up to the same spot and stopped. The commander of the tender didn't act like a bodyguard. They should have rushed back to protect Collins. Instead, stayed where they were, and the soldiers were ordered to get out. And as mentioned above, they were split into 2 sections, one to move the barricade, the other taking cover and returning fire. Collins was obscured from their view about 400 metres away. No one went to protect Collins. A few minutes later, when the ambushers stopped firing at the forward end of the site, the soldiers from the Crossley Tender could hear firing from the direction of Collins' car. That's number 5, the armoured car. They stayed where they were, and waited for the shooting to stop, which is a strange thing to do as well. That account of what happened up front is reliable, but it's not possible to rely on accounts that we have from Collins' end of it. That's where the trickery happened. Sigerson, from the evidence, makes the following deductions. And I'll read from her book. It seems unanimous that the armoured car gunner opened up and began sweeping the hillside with machine gun fire. In view of the ambushers' probable fire and firepower, this would have seemed to have been overkill. It also makes it extremely unlikely that the 2 or at most 3 anti-treaty men at that end could have gotten off such a carefully aimed shot as would have been necessary to account for Collins's fatal wound. They fired in the convoy's general direction, but they could hardly have lifted their heads. Perhaps this intensity of machine gun fire from the armoured car was a defensive measure, but under the circumstances, what was Collins likely to think? He's in the touring car at number 4. Indeed, all things considered, it's not hard to imagine Collins getting out of the car furious and pounding on the armoured car turret, commanding the gunfire to cease fire. If he did so, he would certainly have had to approach from the side of the armoured car, away from the ambushers, that is, away from the direction in which the Vickers gun was firing. That's logical, keeping him clear of friendly fire, as well as covered from the ambushers. If he did so, no one would have seen it except Dalton and his picked drivers in the touring car. No one else could have heard him over the machine gun in the armoured car. The next thing that happened, the reaction he then got from those men with whom he now found himself isolated on a deserted road, may have caused it to instantly dawn on him that he'd fallen into a trap. If he was killed by an entry wound high in his forehead, which exited behind his ear, his assassin would have had to shoot from above him. If he were also shot at very close range, as Dr. Gogarty and other medical examiners suggest, how could anyone have delivered such a shot at such an angle at point blank? If the C&C, the Commander-in-Chief, were not crouching or were fleeing when hit, someone standing on the armoured car could have been in the best position to inflict such a wound. The armoured car was also mobile and had no obstruction behind it. If Collins attempted to flee his associates, the armoured car could have pursued, come up to him quickly, and a sharpshooter standing on it would easily have dealt the blow. It was necessary to ensure that there were no witnesses, not only in the complement of soldiers in the Crossley tender, who were 400 yards up ahead, but also among the ambushers on the hill. The armoured car fills the gap as well. It was the only equipment large enough to conceal a man and what was happening to him from observers on the hill above. The point at which all Free State accounts surprisingly agree is that at the moment Collins died, all firing stopped. It is offered that the ambushers had already retreated when Collins was hit. That is why none of the anti-treaty men saw any casualties on either side. At that point there was no fire at that end except for the Vickers gun in the armoured car, which stopped firing when Collins was dead. It stopped firing then because the purpose of its inordinately intense bombardment had been accomplished. It had camouflaged the sound of an assassin's bullets and created an illusion of intensive firing at that end to account for the only casualty. That's end of Sigerson. The ambushers never claimed any intention to shoot Collins. They didn't believe that he fell at their hands, even accidentally. A member of Collins's escort believed that he was not killed by the ambushers, meaning they believed he was a victim of foul play by men in the convoy. Dalton was later a target of accusations that he colluded in Collins' death. Claims that the machine gun in the armoured car jammed have been proven false, part of a cover-up afterwards. Then you get the question, could this have been planned in advance? Actually, very easily. But only if De Valera and Liam Lynch, who was the IRA Chief of Staff at the time, were in a plot in cooperation with Emmett Dalton on Collins' side, who could control the drivers of the touring car and armoured car, as well as the commander of the tender with the soldiers. Under the pretence of peace talks, they could plan the route of Collins' itinerary and his driving through Bailn of Law, plus his return by the same route. They could also have been able to influence people like Tom Hales, he was young at the time, regarding set up an ambush and exactly where to set it up. Now, the question then is, how was De Valera protected? Once the trap was set, De Valera played his favourite role, the innocent bystander. He played that many times, while saying he wanted peace. If it had been more generally known that Collins was lured south by the promise of talks, questions would have been asked as to who made the promise. Anti-treaty leaders would have compared notes, and they might have quickly realised that De Valera had to be at the bottom of it. To anyone with a quick, I suppose, a background in the history of Ireland and Scotland, the whole thing would have stinked to high heaven of British involvement. Within weeks, it would have been death for De Valera, politically, if not really. So the beneficiaries of Collins' assassination were De Valera, the British imperialist interests in Ireland, north and south. It was necessary to keep Collins' associates permanently confused about what happened. It was necessary to completely deceive De Valera's anti-treaty comrades as to his role. at the same time setting them up to take the blame. And of course the north of Ireland settled down, the south of Ireland. What happened is the Cosgrave government went viciously after the anti-treaty people, and virtually every one of the top leaders were killed before there was peace, which was, I think, May, June the following year. The aftermath of Collins' death. On Dalton's orders, Collins' body was brought to Shannakeil Hospital in Cork, a strange decision because that was a hospital then still controlled by the British. Bon Secours, they passed by Bon Secours Hospital on the way to Shannakeil. Bon Secours Hospital at that time wasn't as big, but the guy was dead. You just had to bring him to any hospital. John Feehan reported that the head nurse, a lady called Eleanor Gordon, along with Commandant Frank Field, they cleaned the wound and bandaged Collins' head. They were certain there was an entry wound on the hairline, or somewhere along the hairline, and an exit wound at the back of the head. Significantly, Gordon also stated that she saw a singed hole on the back of his tunic that looked like a bullet hole, meaning that the weapon that fired it must have been only a few inches away. Miss Gordon was a most reliable person who had been a military nurse in the First World War and was very familiar with gunshot wounds of all types. Now, Sean Hales, he was a Free State Army officer, he was a Dáil deputy and a long-time friend of Collins. He was also a brother of Tom Hales, one of the IRA men who had actually set up the ambush. On numerous occasions, Sean Hales demanded an army inquiry or autopsy into the suspicious circumstances surrounding Collins' death. When his request was turned down, he took his complaint to the Cabinet and voiced his suspicions regarding Dalton's account of the ambush. Hales said he would leave no stone unturned until the doubts as to Collins' death was cleared up. Whenever in Dublin, he would stay at Portobello Barracks, but on the last evening there, he was told there was no accommodation available, so he had to move to a hotel. The next day, 7th of December 22, as he travelled in a sidecar from his hotel, he was attacked and shot dead. Dalton's activities after Collins' death raised another lot of questions. He resigned shortly after the ambush and was given a plush position as Clerk of the Senate by the Free State authorities. He reportedly served during the Second World War in MI5, the British intelligence gathering agency. A guy called Martin Quigley, who was an American Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, he was an OSS agent in Ireland during the Second World War. He maintained that if Dalton's health had allowed, he was in line for the prestigious position as head of the British Commandos. Quigley nurtured a friendship with Dalton and noted, he says, whatever Dalton was doing, he obviously had high-level access to British decision-makers. There was no inquest, no inquiry into Collins' death, and it has to be part of a major cover-up. Even in that troubled period, inquests were routinely held into the deaths of men much less renowned and in far less questionable circumstances. Those present at Collins' death were never formally questioned by any official authority. Even today, an examination of Collins' remains, with the benefit of modern forensics, could answer many questions. For example, the number and location of wounds, from what direction, what range, what kind of weapon, etc. This alone would go a long way in clearing the cloud over his death, a deliberate cloud put there to protect the guilty. Feehan offered a plausible explanation for the failure to hold an inquest. He said, if it was generally known that the British killed Collins, the government feared there would be a strong anti-British and consequently anti-treaty backlash. This could prove to be of tremendous advantage politically to the anti-treaty side, and they, that's the Free State government, therefore decided to suppress it, not to protect the British Secret Service, but to protect themselves. This explains why there was no inquest, no inquiry, and why documents were ultimately destroyed. To be able to blame Collins' death on the IRA was a tremendous propaganda value to the government in winning the Civil War. De Valera's Civil War immediately moved into the area of atrocities and what can only be called war crimes by both sides. The Free State government won. The British were the biggest winners. Most of the top Irish leaders were dead. The Northern Ireland regime was secure. Anglo-American relations were never better. Irish-American relations were never worse. And international public opinion was overwhelmingly on the side of the British. Britain was proven correct in the eyes of the world that the Irish were incapable of governing themselves. De Valera's legacy, this is my opinion, was misery and violence. He wrote the epitaphs for a lot of people who followed him into the Civil War. You could call them betrayers, but they were later betrayed by De Valera. He turned on them when he got into power in 1932. All Collins asked for was an acceptance of the people's will, and for more than 40 years De Valera pushed the Irish into despair and poverty. The South was a basket case until rescued by the EEC in 1973, possibly a little earlier when Lamass got in. More than 1 million people, a quarter of the population, fled Ireland during De Valera's time in power, mostly to the UK, after America shut its doors because of De Valera's stance during the Second World War. And look at what happened. Married men, no work in Ireland, travelled to England to build railways, make motorways, dig ditches, working long hours to send money home. And at best, they saw their wives and children twice or once a year. They rented squalid bedsits with other married men. When they were too old to work, they returned to a wife and children who had built separate lives for themselves in Ireland. Some of these men died strangers in the home they'd helped work and, for years to build. That was what De Valera left for a lot of Ireland. He made numerous attempts to remove Michael Collins and Arthur Griffith from Irish history. As an example, in the lead up to the 50th anniversary of the 1916 Rising, an official government guide, Facts About Ireland, was reprinted after controversy broke out over the exclusion of Collins' picture. The omission occurred after consultation with De Valera. Now, there's also a case, I think it was in the 40s, where some people wanted to make Collins' grave a little bit bigger, and between the graves there was about 6 or 7 inches that you can walk through, and they wanted to move the little wall out to give the grave an extra foot in width and put up a bigger headstone, banned by De Valera, not allowed to do it. John Toory's book gives a really good account of De Valera's pro-British activities in the decades after Collins' death, and that's really worth reading. It's only $5 or $6. That's me, and that's Slievenamon, the armoured car. My then brother-in-law, in 1997, was a mechanic on the army barracks in the Curragh in Kildare, he's one of the mechanics who maintained that. So I was able to get in, and I didn't drive around the square, I drove about 100 metres down the square. The ARR2, Armoured Rolls Royce number 2, which accompanied Collins when he shot dead, played a key role in the ambush. I reckon that the guy who killed Collins was in that. I reckon he was sneaked in Cork and he was sneaked out in Cork. And he just popped up and killed Collins and hid in it all the way. There's only 2 of them surviving worldwide. The other is in a tank museum in Surrey in England. It's actually very difficult to drive. There's no seat. You sit with a metal bar at your back and your 2 legs out straight in front of you. And just 2 pedals. It's really, really weird. I suppose with the 100th anniversary of the Rising just around the corner, a lot of people are certainly looking back, reassessing. I mean, admittedly, a lot of writers are trying to make money out of it too. So I reckon we're now getting the real truth, not De Valera's, but De Valera controlled what was taught in Irish schools. And it's people like Collins, Arthur Griffith, John Devine, who are starting to come to the fore as the prominent people. Now, De Valera, this is quoted by Tim Pat Coogan in his book. He once said, "It's my considered opinion that in the fullness of time, history will record the greatness of Collins and it will be recorded at my expense." And I think that's happening. 500,000 attended Collins' funeral. And just in Glasnevin Cemetery in Dublin in 1922. Now, I enjoyed a tour of the cemetery. That's when I took this photograph in June of this year. The guide explained that a plot in the new part of the cemetery cost about 6,000 Australian dollars. One close to De Valera is about $22,000. And one close to Michael Collins is $90,000. Wow. There's 2 available. He also explained that the majority of those who fill in the evaluation form state that their main reason for visiting the cemetery was to pay homage to Michael Collins. And the guide also mentioned a mysterious French lady who places flowers on Collins' grave every year. And she's done so on the 22nd of August for each of the last 14 years. So she'll be there in 2 days' time. Actually, I did check. Her name is Veronique Crombé. She's an art historian, a lecturer and a guide at the French National Museum in Paris. And she became entranced with the Collins story when she saw Neil Jordan's film, Michael Collins with Liam Neeson in the 90s. She has no Irish connections that she knows of, and she can't explain how she's been drawn to Collins and just to carry on his name and how it's taken such a hold on her. And I suppose we were told by the guide that if you go to Collins' grave any time is always fresh flowers. So a lot of people are doing it.
Yeah.
There were no flowers at all at De Valera's grave.
The curlew takes to flight, and as he flies out over the empty, sad fields of West Cork, with his lonesome call, he must tell the world that the big fellow has fallen and that Michael is gone. On a far-off August day, cold young men in ambush lay on a roadside by a hill where flowers grow. So much hate for one so young, who was right and who was wrong. Though 1,000 years may pass, we'll never know. Candles dripping blood, they placed beside your shoulders. Rosary beads, like teardrops on your fingers. Friends and comrades standing by, in their grief they wonder why. Michael, in their hour of need, you had to go. And when evening twilight came, gently fell the autumn rain. Oh, but you lay still and silent on the ground, as we hung our heads in prayer, in our sorrow and despair. We wondered, was it friend or foe who shut you down? Candles dripping blood, they placed beside your shoulders. Rosary beads, like teardrops on your fingers. Friends and comrades standing by, in their grief they wonder why. Michael, in their hour of need, you had to go. Now the flame that you held high, when you called out to the sky to end the senseless killing and the shame, has now passed to other hands and is carried through the land by some not fit to even speak your name. Candles dripping blood, they placed beside your shoulders. Rosary beads, like teardrops on your fingers. Friends and comrades standing by, in their grief they wonder why. Michael, in their hour of need, you had to go. Michael, in their hour of need, why did you go?